Ladies and gentlemen, the author, Andrew Keen. Oh, there we go. Wait, look at that. You didn't think you'd be
nice photo.
10 feet. Talk about digital vertigo. Yeah. So I'm delighted to have Andrew join this talk about his new book, How to Fix the Future. And just like Scott Galloway's The Four, we have copies of it. And if you're lucky, you can grab Andrew and he might, scribble something down on it. But it's a fascinating read about what I call taking sort of some of the themes you heard this morning from Scott, some of our materials, but taking it to a broader level about the major economic and societal challenges of big tech. And it's been amazing. I've known Andrew for over a decade, and he's been so prescient in so many ways when you think of the lead time associated with projects like publishing books. In fact, I describe Andrew as a contrarian and a tech skeptic, and now in hindsight, perhaps a realist about some of the many aspects of the tech world. His prior books read like what is now perceived as a popular perspective, but I hasten to describe them as anything approaching zeitgeist at the time that they were written. So just to give you an example, in 2008, Andrew wrote The Cult of the Amateur, How Today's Internet is Killing Our Culture. That was 10 years ago. Of course, it's in the news every day, but he got the idea over a decade ago. In 2013, he wrote Digital Vertigo, How Today's Online Social Revolution is Dividing, Diminishing, and Disorienting Us. That's 3 to 4 years before others started to pick up on that theme. So he basically nailed fake news. And in 2015, he published The Internet is Not the Answer. So with this body of work, and now with your latest piece, you forewarned in the Cult of the Amateur that rather than democratize media, that tech would sort of catalyze problems like trolling, like fake news, and you sort of called out the whole surveillance capitalism models of Facebook and Google. And as I recall, you were criticized and termed a Luddite, right, by Silicon Valley. Maybe a lovable Luddite, but a Luddite nonetheless. It must feel good to be vindicated.
Well, he's my agent. Yeah, I got a lot wrong, though. I mean, you've been very kind. In every company I've ever, in Cult of the Amateur, I had a concluding chapter in which I said, well, these are some of the companies that can win in this new world. And within like 6 months of the book, they'd all gone bankrupt. I think my biggest mistake was one day I questioned whether Facebook could grow. This was back in 2008, 2009. So
you can't get them all right.
You can't get them all right. But the bigger stuff, the Cult of the Amateur argument about disintermediated media, whether the old gatekeeper argument. I remember going on Colbert show and. It was his old act when he was slightly different. And at one point he looked at me and he said, "You, sir, you're an elitist." He sort of leaned over the table and he did his whole shtick thing. And "You, sir, you're an elitist." And I thought I was being funny. I leant back and said, "Yeah, what's wrong with that?" And after that, I became public enemy #1 on the internet. I remember the day after I was at my son's soccer game back in California, and I started getting all these phone calls from pizza shops saying, "Did you order 10,000 pizzas?"
Uh-oh.
So the trolls were there then. But, I think the idea of elitism, and I know this is a sort of, I guess, an elitist, you look part of an elite.
Yeah, CEOs only.
You're
elite all the way,
You're
baby.
the elite of the elite, Terry. But this idea that somehow curated media, high-end media, and Jason and I have done some stuff on this too, that there was something immoral or undemocratic is absolutely absurd. You can only get high-quality media if it's properly curated, and you can only get reliable media if it's accountable, and if, again, it's edited and you don't allow anyone to publish anything. I mean, when I was saying this in 2007, it seemed obvious. But I think everyone had drunk the Web 2.0 Kool-Aid then. And my inspiration for the book was getting invited to Tim O'Reilly's food camp. Some of you may remember that. Some of you may have been there up in I live in Santa Rosa, just up the road in Sebastopol. And everyone was drinking the Kool-Aid. This idea that we were going to replace media, replace the elites, everyone would have a voice. And it just seemed fairly obvious to me that that was a catastrophe in waiting. And I said it quite clearly. And media liked what I was saying, but I think if you worked in old media, it was harder to be as sort of, I guess, unabashedly and unashamedly elitist.
So it's kind of like the inverse of Chris Anderson's The Long Tail.
Yeah, it was and you never hear, I'm sure he's not here, maybe under one of the tables, Chris Anderson should be. You wrote this garbage, The Long Tail. It was one of the most disgraceful, there's only one book which is even more disgraceful and dishonest, which was his book called Free, which some of you may have read, which was somehow fetishizing the business model of Free. Of course, the book he was paid for, and he was paid large amounts of money by old media to publish a book called
irony
Free.
there.
But you never hear the long tail anymore. These people were disreputable, they were dishonest, or they were just deluded. You never hear from Larry Lessig anymore, and there's nonsense about Creative Commons. He's doing something else. He was an elite, he was Harvard law professor earning 500 grand a year, and he was idealizing Free. You never hear from Anderson anymore. I think he became an entrepreneur, and I think he even failed in that. So these people have gone away. And I was once at a restaurant in San Francisco having lunch with someone, and Anderson came up to me and he said, "You remember me?" I said, "Yeah." He said
Barely.
to me, "You've made your career trashing me." So I should have said, "Well, you want like 10% of that?" But these people took it very personally, and they were wrong. And the problem is that the damage, it's not just sort of intellectual vanity here, it's the damage they did was significant. We're seeing it. We're seeing it with the election. We're seeing it with the crisis still of newspapers. We're seeing it with the long-term crisis of the idea of truth, and I think that's going to become even more sort of paramount with new technologies where we won't be able to distinguish between what actually happened and what was somehow invented. So this stuff hasn't gone away. I mean, some good stuff's happened. I always champion and I'm not a big fan of Rupert Murdoch's politics, but he was the one who pioneered the paywall. And finally, people are starting to, when I wrote Cult of the Amateur, it was politically incorrect to suggest that people should pay for content. That you should pay for your newspapers online, or you should pay for your music or your movies. And now, with Spotify,
or your
Netflix, the New York Times, or the FT, or the Wall Street Journal, people are paying again. So we've come to our senses. But Free Free combined with these open platforms, I think came close to destroying traditional media, or curated, reliable media.
So what I like about your latest book, How to Fix the Future, is rather than these elitist, pompous authors just laying out problems and then sort of saying you're on your own, you actually took the step to say, okay, let's research this. You visited with, 150 people?
Yeah.
All over the world to come up with solutions.
Well, I'm pretty elitist and pompous.
Yeah.
But I did go out on the road. So yeah, I spent a year. So the background to this book is I wrote, Terence very kindly introduced my work. I've written 3 books which were very critical. The first, Cult of the Amateur, which was a critique of Web 2.0. Digital Vertigo, which was basically arguing that social media was anything but social. And then The Internet's Not the Answer, which was a kind of a structural critique of the digital economy in terms of equality and justice. But more and more people, there's so many books now published on this stuff. I figured, well, I don't want to just, firstly, I've already written 3, and I didn't have much extra stuff to add. And secondly, as an author, you know this as an investor, you know this as entrepreneurs, timing is everything, and you need to keep ahead of the crowd. So I figured, well, there are all these problems, now the challenge is fixing it. How are we going to fix the big problems of the digital age, from the looming crisis of unemployment to the kind of structural consequences of inequality, to surveillance capitalism, to the cultural crisis associated with social media. So I went out on the road. I spent a year traveling around. I went to Estonia and Singapore and India. Some of the travels I did, I didn't even get into the book. I went to Russia, spent a lot of time in Europe, East and West Coast. And it's not a book of theory. It's not some sort of ideal solution saying, okay, well, blockchain's going to solve everything, or this new startup theoretically could solve everything. I actually went out and looked at what people are doing to fix this stuff. Because ultimately, I think the issue, the meta theme in my book is agency. We've created technology which kind of replicates much of what we do as human beings. But the one thing algorithms can't do is have agency. They can't have goals. They can't be creative. So in our history as humans, we've always broken things, but we've also fixed them too. So I looked at the book is I spent a lot of time traveling, a lot of thematic chapters, one on Estonia, one on Singapore, one on Brussels. But it's also historical. I look back and say, well, how can we learn from the past about fixing this stuff? Because I think, and you and I have talked about this a lot, the digital revolution is profound. It's not a cosmetic revolution. It's changing everything, every industry. In media, you know, the media was the first industry to be radically disrupted by this. But every industry now, from transportation to healthcare to government to banking, everything's being transformed. And so I look back at the Industrial Revolution and say, what can we learn from it? And it takes work. We need to roll up our sleeves and work together as entrepreneurs, as investors, as regulators, as citizens, as educators, because we've got to fix this stuff. If we don't, we're in huge trouble.
Yeah, what I like about it is you go back in history and say, look, actually, we're at this crisis point, but we've been here before, right?
Yeah, I mean, not identically. I mean, history doesn't... I interviewed Brad Burnham, some of you may know him, one of the general partners at Union Square Ventures, and he quoted Mark Twain about history. It may not repeat itself, but it rhymes, and I think that's a good way of thinking about it. We can learn that when we break stuff, we also have a responsibility to fix it. And the worst thing we can do now in our current situation is just kind of hold up our hands and say, well, what can we do? You know, Google is almost $1 trillion company, or Facebook controls everything, or the kids are addicted to devices, or you know, blockchain or Bitcoin is going to undermine the world financial system. So what can we do? There's nothing we can do. If that's our attitude and we treat all this stuff as inevitable, then we lose. So it's our job to have agency and try and fix this stuff.
All right, so let's do that. Let's reject fatalism right now and walk into your. I want to go through your 5 tools, because you've suggested there's 5 avenues to sort of address these sort of societal and economic. First one, regulation. We're 10 days away from the implementation of the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, and there was a lot of discussion about that this morning and its effect on the ecosystem and on the...
Was it positive, a lot of the discussion?
Well, I think the takeaways were that whilst, you know, that wasn't perhaps the intention of the law, that it may in fact weaken the smaller parties and strengthen
that is a concern.
The duopoly. How much agency do you put in this notion of regulation? You saw the Congress sort of, you know, cock up their interview with Mark Zuckerberg. It basically, it reminded me of my fireside with Martin Sorrell. He basically just kept running on and on. He ran out the clock, so I got zucked.
Well, Martin's a good friend of mine, and ironically, he's actually a supporter of my. He was one of the early champions of Cult of the Amateur, even though he's in the advertising business. So he recognizes the problems of a content business, sort of a demonetized or a free content business relying exclusively on advertising. I think regulation is extremely important. I think the East Coast people are a little bit more receptive to this idea than on the West Coast. But the Europeans are leading here. I have a chapter on, I had a series of conversations with Margrethe Vestager, the EU Commissioner of Antitrust. She's taking on Google. She has 3 separate antitrust investigations of Google. She's doing what the FTC should have done. I think Obama in particular has a lot to answer for. He was essentially seduced by Silicon Valley, particularly by Eric Schmidt. And they just, the American regulators have become, they're just, you know, they're worrying about AT&T and Time Warner. They should be worrying about Google. We're worrying about AT&T when it comes to antitrust is absurd. So I think that America, as Winston Churchill famously said, he always said everything about everything. And I'm not sure if he actually said this, but I'm going to invent something he said. The Americans always do everything wrong until they get it right, and they're miles behind the Europeans on this regulation.
Right. Except for maybe California.
Well, antitrust, the data protection stuff, the German laws about forcing the platforms to become media companies and be accountable for the content they publish and being massively fined if they don't. This is all good stuff. And the Americans will have to catch up. The important thing to bear in mind, always the response to the innovation argument, the regulation argument is regulation is against innovation, which of course is entirely incorrect. If it hadn't been for the regulatory sort of investigation of Microsoft in the 90s, you never would have had Web 2.0. The reason why the digital economy is now struggling so much, it's so hard to be a startup entrepreneur, is because it's a winner-take-all economy, and the only exits really are being acquired by one of the big 5 companies. It's a really uncompetitive environment, and I think antitrust is really important in terms of innovation. I also think that what I argue in the book anyway is that the GDPR may be interesting in terms of stimulating innovation.
Right.
And no law is final, so you have to start somewhere.
Right.
The problem with the digital economy is it's entirely unregulated. So the consequences where we're at today is a consequence of an absence of regulation. So I don't want to see regulation as being against innovation. I think they go together.
Yeah, in fact, Scott Galloway this morning argued we need regulation not because we're socialists, we need regulation because we're capitalists.
Yeah, Galloway and I are pretty much on the same page on
and it actually rolls into your second tool, which is competitive innovation. Scott Galloway stood on stage this morning and said, the markets are no longer competitive and they're not innovating.
I saw Scott speak. I didn't see him this morning, but I saw him speak at DLD a couple of weeks ago. And I mean, we're very much on the same page. We've written similar books. And the fact that people like us are writing this, I think, reflects the shift in the zeitgeist. Roger McNamee, some of you may know from Elevation Partners, who was an early investor in Facebook, and was the person who introduced Mark Zuckerberg to Sheryl Sandberg, has become so outraged with what's happened that he's basically camped out in DC and is spending his time persuading Congress people to change their position. So I think you're going to see a shift in DC on the regulation side.
What were you getting at? Third is social responsibility. What were you driving at?
Well, social responsibilities, I have the chapter of my first, the title of my first chapter is Moore's Law, but not Gordon Moore's Law. This is Thomas Moore's Law, Thomas More being the 16th century author of Utopia. The idea that we have a responsibility to make our world better. And as citizens, we're seeing it now in Silicon Valley. We're seeing it with people like Roger McNamee. We're seeing it with his business partner, Tristan Harris, who had been an ethicist at Google and now is leading the fight for sort of creating an ethical movement for programmers in Silicon Valley. We're seeing it with people like Frida Kapoor Klein in Oakland. You can be an investor, you can make money, and you can also do good. We're even seeing it with, the baddest of bad boys, Travis Kalanick, who I've known for years. He's got the worst press, much of it deserved. Even he now is starting a venture fund trying to create jobs. So I think there is a need for, it's like in the 19th century. Carnegie spent the first half of his life exploiting people, but he spent the second half of his life reinvesting in society. Gates has pioneered this, and a lot of it would be interesting to see what Bezos does on this front. I think he's the key figure, and in many ways, Amazon is the key company, I think, in the future.
So it calls in the adage, with great power comes great responsibility.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, and we all have responsibility, though. We should all be demanding more of our regulators. We should all be demanding more of our companies. Doesn't mean companies become non-profits, but we should also be critical when we hear of companies like Google or Facebook that claim to be making the world a better place and being sort of unselfish in their behavior. We know that's not true. So I think entrepreneurs and media people have a responsibility to tell the truth about their own companies. Doesn't mean they shouldn't make money, but the impact of digital media is so profound. We know, and most of us here probably have kids, we know how it's shaping future generations. We know how it's reinventing our social lives and our identities. This is important stuff.
So number 4, worker and consumer choice.
Well, consumers lead. I have some examples from the food industry and the car industry. Consumers have to be more demanding. I called my first book Cult of the Amateur. I could have written a book called Cult of the Consumer. I think one of the problems with Silicon Valley is they've created a cult out of the consumer. And they presented the consumer as having sort of infinite rights. So consumers can have and do whatever they like. They even have the right to free stuff. But of course, when you have the right to free stuff, ultimately you're the one, as we know with these surveillance capitalist models, they're the one being mined. They're the ones being exploited. So consumers need to be more demanding. With or without the GDPR, they need to demand rights. They need to be much more aggressive in what they get. We can see it with the food industry. Yep. In the middle of the 19th century, the food industry was incredibly exploitative. The food that came out of the first wave of the Industrial Revolution was poisonous and purposefully addictive. We had change over the years. Same with the American car industry. I think we're at a point, I argue in the book, as we were in the digital media, as we were in the 1950s with the American car industry. American car industry was incredibly dominant and arrogant. They produced death traps. Ralph Nader famously wrote a book in '65 called Unsafe at Any Speed. The American car industry really hasn't recovered since. We're at a similar point, I think, with digital media, and consumers have to be more aggressive, and workers as well. I mean, in one of the chapters, I deal with the rights of the precariat, the Uber and the Lyft drivers, the people who rent out their homes on Airbnb. We need a new kind of social contract. I did a debate last night at Intelligence Squared with Ian Bremmer and Yasha Mount and Alina Polyakova, and we all agreed, we disagreed on some stuff, but we all agreed that in this new digital age, we need a new kind of social contract. That's why in my book, yep, the Estonian chapter's very interesting. The really scary thing on the horizon, more than anything else, is the Chinese model. The Chinese are reinvented 1984 Orwellianism in a digital context, a really, really scary kind of authoritarianism. And we in the West need to figure out a democratic alternative to that. The Estonians are pioneering. I'm going to Estonia in a couple of weeks. But it's terrifying, the world that the Chinese are creating, especially with these new technologies like facial recognition technology and obviously AI, which they tend to be leading in. So
I was fascinated by the Estonian example of two-way transparency. So
right,
not only does the government know everything about you, but you know everything that the government knows about you, and so it's
I don't think we can fall back on 19th
Not sure
century.
that's going to work here.
Well, I don't think we can fall back on 19th century assumptions about privacy. I don't think the old sort of ideal of us having absolute privacy in the digital age is probably recoverable. Right. But so we need a more reciprocal kind of arrangement with the government so that, sure, the government can look at our stuff as more and more stuff goes online, but we need to be notified. So the accountability, the transparency needs to go both ways. And the Estonians are really interesting here, and we can learn a lot from what smaller countries are doing, not only at the federal level, but at the local level. I talked to Gina Raimondo, the governor of Rhode Island, and she's been inspired by what the Estonians are doing, and she's trying to do it at a local level, just as the Californians are.
Yep. So you argue about how one of the solutions to how to fix the future will not come from technology, but from humans. The final chapter is on education, which, as you mentioned, a lot of us have kids, and we think about.
How many people have kids here?
Yeah.
Everyone.
I mean, vast majority of the room. So where this is headed is really, really important to us. And you argue we need to teach kids to have agency. What do you mean by that? I think it could be the most important point of the book.
Yeah. Look, agency is obviously a sort of a slightly squishy word, but it means being able to sort of change our world. And as I said, it's important to think about agency in the context of AI and the fear that some people have, as Bill Gates and Elon Musk, that we're creating technology that will eventually acquire its own consciousness and enslave us. So it's our final invention. I'm not sure that's the case. But certainly we need to we've created, we're on the verge of, and that's your world, we're on the verge of a smart world. Everything's becoming smarter and smarter. Smart cars, self-driving cars, smart homes, smart cities, even smart bodies in the way in which computer chips will eventually be sewn into our physical bodies. This is the next wave. This is the new thing in Silicon Valley. it's going to change everything. It's going to change how we organize. But above all else, it's going to change how we work. It's going to undermine many of the traditional jobs of the industrial age, not only drivers, but lawyers and doctors, potentially even, investors and writers.
Now, investment banking will be the last question. Sorry.
The last one. You'll be the last guy to go, Terry. So we need to figure out so it's Moore's law, or Gordon Moore's law. This stuff, I wouldn't say it's inevitable, but it's extremely likely. Billions of dollars are going into investments and startups and research and all the rest of it. But what are we going to do as human beings? How do we fit into this world? The old industrial education system, the top-down rote learning system, was designed for an entirely different age, an age where Google didn't do all our math problems, or Google didn't find anything in a millisecond. So what do we do? The one thing, and I think this is the sort of the core theme in the book, the one thing that computers don't have is agency. Computers aren't able to exist in that gray area between sort of data crunching and the subjective world. So computers can't be empathetic.
Right.
Computers can't be creative. Algorithms can't have goals. So what we need to focus on in our education are developing kids, and maybe adults, because we can turn the education system on its head. The idea of lifelong learning is a no-brainer, and maybe kids seem to, in some ways, don't need education as much as older people. But we need to be teaching them to have that kind of empathy, creativity, so that they have something to do, so that not only will they add value to the economy, but they have meaningful lives. Because this technology can replace a lot of the menial stuff, which is very attractive.
Well, I'll tell you, there's...
So we need alternative education systems like Waldorf, like Montessori. So that's where my book ends on. The Waldorf education system is particularly focused on developing what one teacher described as the muscle of agency in kids.
Yep. Well, there's one other thing that computers can't do very well, and it's one of the reasons why I do what I do: comedy. Yeah. So show me an algorithm that can spit out a parody video. Forget it, isn't going to happen. Andrew Keen, 5 solutions, tools to addressing how to fix the future because of what's going on with technology's impact on society. It's a fascinating read. Like I said, we've got books out in the hall, and hopefully Andrew can even sign a few of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry.
Coming to DMS.